All right, so now in part two, we're going to keep talking about the non-native Cyprinidae, and we're going to concentrate specifically on the Asian carp. And the first thing you may say is, well, aren't all carp Asian? Yeah, okay, they're all from Asia, and that's true. But we just call a subgroup of the non-native carps the Asian carp. And they're very different than the common carp and the goldfish. And so that's why we kind of split them off. So we call this subgroup the Asian carp, although yes, all carp come from Asia. I understand that. This group that we call the Asian carp is made up of the grass carp, the big head carp, the silver carp, and the black carp. And so let's talk about each of those. The grass carp is a fish that eats grass and vegetation. And it's really good at this. And in the United States, we don't have any large herbivorous fish. Some of the smaller minnows are herbivorous. A lot of fish are detritivores, but we don't have anything that eats large macro vegetation. But the grass carp does. And so it's been stocked and used in the United States for this purpose, to control vegetation where you don't want too much vegetation. And so if we want to identify a grass carp, it's going to have big scales like a carp, but it has a short dorsal fin, whereas the common carp had a long dorsal fin. One of the more striking characteristics that you'll notice is it has a big horizontal mouth that kind of wraps all the way around the front of the head. And also, if you dissect them and look at the pharyngeal teeth, they've got grooves in them that other fish don't have. And so here you can see the big scales in the short dorsal fin. Here you can see that too. And if you look at that mouth, you see how it's very horizontal and it wraps all the way around. Their head is kind of flat on top. This is what the pharyngeal teeth look like. You can see those grooves there. I imagine that those grooves kind of act like scissors and that they rub in between each of those and help cut up the vegetation. I'm just guessing. Here's another look at those grooves in the pharyngeal teeth. And like I said, so these are the only carp that are somewhat controlled in the United States. And that's because if you want to stock them, they have to be triploid. And so if you want to control vegetation, you can go buy a grass carp, but every grass carp that is sold must have blood taken from it and tested to prove it's triploid before you can sell it. And so, of course, that adds to the cost per fish, but they're still not that expensive. And if they're triploid, they have an extra set of chromosomes, then they're sterile. They can't reproduce. And so, presumably, so we can stock them and not worry about them getting a reproducing population. And they don't really compete directly with any other species, but they are modifying the environment. They're getting rid of vegetation. So they're going to have some effect on the other fish. But again, this is usually in a management situation where we know that we want to control vegetation. The problem is that there are lots of regular diploids out there. And so these have been stocked and been stocked since the 60s for control of vegetation. And only more recently, in the last 20 or 30 years, have we passed laws that they have to be triploid. So in the meantime, there's been lots of escapees, there's lots of diploids, and there's lots of reproducing populations already out there. So they're not perfectly controlled, but they're somewhat controlled. Okay, now similar to the grass carp is the black carp. And this one is not as common as the other carps we're going to be talking about, but it could be. And there's a lot of concern because this species is expanding its range and it has the potential to be a very aggressive, problematic, exotic invader. And so I've never seen one in real life, but it would be nice to know they're out there and be prepared. So if you ever catch one, that you know what you've got. And they look very similar to a grass carp. So the best I can say is if you ever get a grass carp that looks funny to you, it might be a black carp, so hold on to it. You should hold on to all carp you catch, kill them, but hold on to the black carp and record them. And so I found some pictures that show some of the differences here. It looks like in the black carp, their head is more pointy, more cone shaped. Um, and so that may be a little bit more obvious. If you look at them from above and close the mouth in the adults, you can see the bottom lip in the grass carp. You can't see it in the black carp. So again, these characteristics I don't think are 100% true for every fish, but if you get enough of them, you can get a positive identification. Shows here the lateral line, whereas it has a little bit of a dip right up there behind the operculum in the grass carp, but it doesn't have that dip in the black carp. And in all these pictures, you can kind of notice that the black carp is more black. And so I'm betting that if you ever catch one, that's what you would notice, is that it's a very dark grass carp, which would make you look at it a little bit more closely. So why are they here, or what do? They eat mollusks. And that's why they were brought over. They were brought over. The first black carp were probably accidentally introduced when some other carp were stocked, and that original stocking died off. But later they were brought over on purpose, stocked in aquaculture ponds to control snails. And then when the ponds flooded, they escaped, and now they are breeding in the Mississippi River. And they've been found in Illinois, southern Illinois. So they're expanding northward. And so why do we need to control mollusks in these aquaculture ponds? Because of some parasites of the fish, specifically things like yellow grub, which has this complicated life cycle where fish infected with the grub gets eaten by a heron. Then the heron defecates the grub eggs into the water, which hatch. They go find a mollusk, usually a snail. They develop in that snail, and then the next life stage is released, which goes and infects the fish. And so if you can get rid of the snails, you can break this life cycle. And if you're in an aquaculture pond where you're trying to raise lots of fish in a high density, you need to control these diseases. And so the black carp were brought over to eat the snails to reduce the infection of yellow grub. But it's a bad idea because, of course, eventually they escaped, and now they're a problem in the natural ecosystems. Okay, so our biggies, the big problem today, the one that we're putting all our effort into trying to manage somehow, are the big head carp and the silver carp. And this is the problem in fisheries right now, and everybody's working on these problems. These are extremely large fish, some of the biggest fish that you're going to find out there in the United States. They're extremely fecund. They're just naturally fecund, and then if you have big females, they just have a lot of eggs. They're planktivores, and so they feed at the base of the food web, and they're very big fish, and they can get very big very quickly. They grow quickly. And so there's just a number of problems here. They feed at the base of the food web. The silver carp feeds on phytoplankton and some zooplankton. The bighead carp feeds on zooplankton and some phytoplankton. And that's the base of the aquatic food web. And every single native fish at some point in their life relies upon those plankton. Most of our native fish, when they're small, they rely on those plankton, and then they get big enough and then they switch to invertebrates or other fish. Some of our native fish feed on that plankton their whole life. But no matter what, if you're a native fish, you need those plankton. And those plankton capture the energy from the sun and provide it to everyone else in the food web. Well, if these fish feed at the base of that food web and eat those, it short circuits the food web. All that energy just goes straight into these two species, and that's why we're really concerned about them. And we've seen that these things have had an effect. I mean, we're concerned about it. We're starting to measure an actual effect by these fish. For example, if you look at native fish like bigmouth buffalo and gizzard shad in the Illinois River, these are fish that are most likely to directly compete with the silver carp and the bighead carp, and we've been seeing that their body condition has decreased as the carps have invaded. We've seen a decrease in the catch per unit of effort of native fish in the upper Missouri as the carps become more prevalent. So we're starting to document our fears are coming true. And not only are they very dangerous to the native aquatic food web, but they're dangerous to humans. Silver carp are large, and when they're startled, they leap out of the water. And there are often high densities of these fish. And so this is very dangerous to boaters and skiers. People who are on the water, you get hit by one of these things, you're going to feel it. So there's just a lot of reasons we're concerned about these fish. And so, like I said, they get big. Here's a big head carp. You can see how large they get. This is the inside. You can see both ovaries of this fish, and a big female can have 1,000,000 eggs, no problem. And so they can have lots of babies, but like I said, they grow very quickly. So they quickly grow larger than any of our native piscivorous fish. So there's nothing there to control them. Again, here's to show you some of these, how big these fish can get. The one, the guy with the fishing pole here, that's the Kentucky State Record silver carp. And it pulled this guy around for an hour. He snagged it in Barkley, and it pulled him through the canal into Kentucky Lake before he was able to land it. Big, powerful fish. And so if you look here, this shows the spread of the Asian carp since 1970. And they started down in Arkansas, and here it's going to go through again. And you can see how these fish have been spreading throughout the Midwest. And they're a problem in a number of places. So for example, the Illinois River, this is where they are really dense, and supposedly there are more silver carp in the Illinois River than there are in their native, in their native range. So one estimate here is that you've got 2,800 carp per river mile that weighs, almost 5,000 pounds. In the lower Illinois River, 63% of the fish biomass was this one species, was silver carp. Nearly 100% of the fish greater than 16 inches was a silver carp, producing 10 million pounds per year. So that suggests you could pull out 10 million pounds, and then next year you could pull out another 10 million pounds. It would replace itself. Tremendous productivity in the Illinois River. All right, so if we look in the Illinois River, this is where we have collected people have collected information that sort of suggests that the Asian carp are having an influence on native species. What we're looking at here are gizzard shad and bigmouth buffalo, and these are a couple of native species that are most likely to directly compete with the bighead carp and the silver carp. On the x-axis, you've got the year, and the y-axis, you have fish condition, which is a measure of relative plumpness. And so this is like the BMI in humans. It's a ratio. It looks at how plump you are relative to your length or your size. So in fish, we look at the weight of the fish relative to its length. And when fish are healthy and they're getting a lot of food, they fill out and they're plumper. And so the higher the condition, the more food the fish is getting and the healthier it is, the better the water quality and things like that. And so this is from, again, the Illinois River. And if you look at the dotted line, that indicates when the population of silver carp began to get noticeable and considered the start of the invasion of the Asian carp. Prior to this invasion, you see the condition of these two species was pretty good, and it had lots of variability. But then after invasion, you can see that the condition dropped and it was much less variable. We interpret this as evidence of an influence on these native fish because they're now competing with the Asian carp. And so if you look at the distribution map, you can see that they're spread throughout the Midwest and all the way up the Illinois River. And again, the Illinois River has got a very high density of these carp, and they've moved all the way up to Chicago. And that's a big concern by a lot of people because they are knocking on the door of the Great Lakes, specifically Lake Michigan. And there's a $7 billion fishery industry in these Great Lakes. And there's a lot of concern of what's going to happen if these fish get into the Great Lakes, because the same problems could occur in the Great Lakes, is that these fish feed at the base of the food web and could compete with other species, and it could be a mess. And so how are they going to get into Lake Michigan? Well, if you look at the Illinois River, upstream where it starts, you've got the Des Plaines River, which sort of flows into and eventually sort of becomes the Illinois River. And then you also have the Chicago River, which used to flow into Lake Michigan. And these used to not be connected. You had something called the Chicago Portage, which was a low-lying marshy area between these two rivers. And the Native Americans showed this to Europeans and showed, hey, you know, if you bring your boats up here, you only have to drag them for a short distance across this portage, and then you can get to Chicago River, and then you can get to the big lake. And so this is one of the reasons that Chicago sprang up where it did, because Europeans said, hey, look, if we just dig a canal and connect these two, then we can connect the Great Lakes to the Illinois River, to the Mississippi River, and move our ships between these two. So that's what they did. In fact, they reversed the flow of the Chicago River. So instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, it now flows in the other direction, and it flows down the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which connects the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River, and ultimately connects all these water bodies. And that's a problem because these used to not be connected. Now they're connected. So now you have invasive species in the Great Lakes that can get into the Illinois River. So things like the zebra mussel, which is spread all the way down here to Kentucky. Things like the round goby or the oriental weatherfish. I don't know if the oriental weatherfish came that way, but the round goby is moving down the Illinois River. So you got all these invasives coming down into the Illinois River. And you've got the Asian carp, which are now coming up the Illinois River and can get into Lake Michigan through this canal. So to try to stop this, they built an electric barrier that is supposed to repel the fish and keep them from getting into Lake Michigan. And here's a picture of it. And the idea is you've just got this very high voltage gradient. And so as the fish swims toward the lake, the voltage gets higher and higher, so it sort of trains them to swim in the other direction. And it's been tested, and it's pretty effective, but there has been some evidence that fish, especially small fish, can make it through this. And if the fish slip in between barges, they might be able to make it through this. So, you know, it's not 100% effective. No barrier is. So there's some other designs that people are testing, things like bubble curtains, carbon dioxide, sound barriers. Of course, you know, an electric barrier is very dangerous if you've got people who, you know, recreational boaters or fishermen. And so we're trying to find these other barriers that are a little bit safer because they'd like to put them in other places, like Pickwick Dam here on the Tennessee River, or at Kentucky Lake or Barkley Lake. In order to try to limit the spread of these fish, to keep them from getting into places where they have not yet spread. So these are some of the things that are being proposed. So in Illinois, a few years ago, the states that are around the Great Lakes actually sued the state of Illinois in order to make them do something about the silver carp. Now the lawsuit got thrown out, but it was designed to get some leverage and draw attention to this and get some money proposed to control these fish. Now, are they in the Great Lakes already? There has been a bighead carp actually caught in Lake Erie, and they have found Asian carp DNA above the barrier and in the Great Lakes. but that's DNA in the water. There's lots of ways that DNA could get in the water, from nets, from fish, from other things. But it also might be an indicator that the fish are already there. They did find an actual Asian carp above the barrier, but not in Lake Michigan just yet. What are other things they're doing in Illinois? They're building a backup to that electric barrier, so if it ever goes down, the lake is not unprotected. They're considering a chemical barrier as a way to back up that electric barrier. Things like targeted removal, where they're trying to specifically go out and put effort into removing the carp in order to reduce their density. Hiring new carp biologists. They've got an office now that's dedicated to controlling the Asian carp. And establishing a commercial fishery. Again, trying to reduce their numbers so that they don't have as much pressure to spread out, so maybe they won't try and spread into the lake. So all these together, that's a lot of effort, and there's hope that they're all going to work and keep these fish out. What about here in Kentucky? What's going on? So the fish have been in Kentucky Lake for about a decade or so. They're also very numerous in Barkley Lake. So we'd like to keep them from spreading any further. So we are aggressively studying them and targeting them in Kentucky and Barkley Lakes to try to reduce their numbers and try to understand them. A lot of effort going into developing a commercial fishery for Asian carp as a way to try to keep their numbers down and keep them from having too adverse an effect on the native fish. Looking at putting in barriers at Kentucky and Barkley dams, like also Pickwick Dam, try to keep the fish from spreading further up the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers, try to keep fish from the Ohio and the Mississippi from repopulating the lakes. Problem with the barriers are that they also stop native fish. And so we have native fish like paddlefish and things that make long migrations that need to be able to cross these dams, and a barrier is going to inhibit those. So this is a pretty big problem for us. Also mentioned again that silver carp are jumpers, and they're large fish, and there are lots of them, and you can see here they start throwing themselves out of the water. They can be very dangerous, and there's been lots of reports of people getting hit, people getting bones broken. No one's been killed yet as far as I know, but it's probably going to happen. So you don't have to look very much. I put a few links on the Canvas page showing you what it looks like when these fish are all jumping and out of control. So take a look at those. So finally, how are we going to identify these fish? They're usually large, and they've got an eye that sits really low on their face. So they're pretty easy to notice that they're an Asian carp. The way we tell them apart, we tell the big head from the silver is similar to the way we tell the gold eye from the moon eye. We look at the keel on the stomach, and in the gold eye, the keel goes all the way up to the throat where you wear your gold chain. In the silver carp, the keel goes all the way up to the throat where you wear your silver chain. So that's one way to remember it. You can also look at the gill rakers. The silver has sponge-like gill rakers. They eat more phytoplankton, really small stuff. So if you look at the gill rakers, you can identify these as well. So here you can see that big eye. It's kind of an ugly looking fish. Here you can see the keel and how it goes to the throat in the silver carp. Here's the big head carp gill rakers, and they're very closely spaced, but they're not sponge-like. This gill raker will capture very small phytoplankton. Here's another picture, again, showing the sponge-like gill rakers of the silver carp to the finger-like gill rakers of the big head carp. Also, these fish will hybridize, and you can look at the rakers, and they're kind of twisted and funky looking. It's a pretty reliable way to identify a hybrid. Another thing that we can identify on these fish, we can identify the sexes pretty easily. If you feel the pectoral fin and it's rough, that's usually a male, and that's because the males signal the females by rubbing their belly with their pectoral fin, and that we're supposed to signal the female to release her eggs. And a side effect of this is that the male's pectoral fin is more rough, and also that tends to rub a spot raw on the females, and we call these spawning patches. And so if you're sampling carp and you see that they have these wounds on their abdomen, that is probably a spawning patch, and that suggests that they're trying to spawn, and that comes from the male rubbing his pectoral fin. And so here you can see some wounds on the ventral keel of these fish. Here you can see between the pelvic and pectoral fins, you can see this bright red wound where presumably a male was rubbing. And you see a very similar thing here, again, between the pelvic and the pectoral fins. So that's just something else you can look out for. Okay, so that's it for all our non-native minnows. I'm sorry to bum you out, but hey, they're a bummer, and they're here, and we have to deal with them. So let me know if you've got any questions, and I'll talk to you later. See ya.